Hello, friends, and welcome to the eighth part of the British revenue extortion in Tirunelveli district. In the previous part, we had a look at the Amani system, which was a hodgepodge of the Nawab's revenue system, and the changes introduced by Lushington, who was the first British collector of the district in around 1801. That system lasted till 1810, and then it fell apart. So the second system the British implemented, or the second experiment the British tried, ran from 1810 to roughly 1821, and it was known as the Decennial Lease system. So decennial means every 10 years, and the basic idea of this system was that the revenue amount was fixed for a period of 10 years. So let's have a look at this system and see what were the key points. So, like I pointed out in the previous parts, the biggest change from the Indian to the British occupation was that the British became the sole owners of the land. So the term they used to refer to themselves was as the government. So the government became the sole owner of the land, and the land was leased out to the farmers for a fixed sum. Now this fixed sum was known as the rent. So every year you basically paid rent to kind of farm on the land, to have the right to farm on the land. And the decennial lease system, as I've said before, was the British concept of leasing land to farmers for 10 years for a fixed sum. So what used to happen was the rent of the land was fixed very high, because I have pointed out previously, if there are 10 acres in a plot or in a section, then entire 10 acres were assumed to be extremely productive or fertile, and the prices were set extreme unrealistically high. Now in 1817 there was a massive grain price crash which caused a lot of distress, and collections had to be again suspended. Now the decennial lease system was introduced in 1810, but it took a couple of years for it to come into operation, and in that period the farmers had a little bit of relief. But once the screws were tightened, what was done was that the leading men of the village, so the village headmen or the rich men of the village or the really prosperous farmers, were made responsible for any shortfall in revenues. So if the village was supposed to collect 1 lakh rupees in revenue, and there was a shortfall of say 40,000 rupees, so they were only able to collect 60,000 rupees, then the 40,000 rupees shortfall had to be made up by the leading men of the village. So the British did not miss any revenue, and what it was expected was that the villagers would then uh, kind of return the money to the leading men of the village. And the villagers used to do that till a certain point of time, obviously, before droughts, famines, and everything completely broke down the system. Now this was not unopposed. There were between somewhere between 1810 and 1821, there were serious riots in a particular part of Tirunelveli district, uh, and the mirasdars, or the people who were responsible for collecting the revenue. So these were still carryover from the old system, and the mirasdars would themselves be completely wiped out in a few years. Their properties, were homes, were destroyed by mobs, and they were forced to flee to Travancore. So Travancore is in Kerala. It's the and it was a princely state, so quite a enlightened family. So what happened was between 1815 and 1821, an attempt was made to introduce the Rayatwari or the Rayotwari system, where the British government would deal directly with the rayats or the farmers. But this was opposed, and the people said that you give us a 25% deduction on rent if you want to introduce this system. So this system also kind of fell apart. So somehow the decennial lease system ran till 1821 before it was abandoned in favor of what was known as the Olongo system. So we'll have a look at the Olongo system in the next part. So the East India Company. So remember, the East India Company was really a nationalized company. So they had a board of directors, but the board of directors reported to the British. There was a controlling committee of the British Parliament, and the East India Company used to report to them. So Rayatwari was being introduced in a lot of parts of Tamil Nadu, and the board of directors was actually opposed to this. So while the East India Company was again a looting operation. But sometimes, better sense prevailed, because their view of the Rayatwari system was to dissolve this unity of interest and common stock of labor by requiring each to take, instead of the share which he possessed and owned, a defined part of the whole land of the village, would not be very different from dissolving a joint stock company in England and requiring each proprietor to trade upon his portion of it in order to be separately taxed. So they recognized the craziness of the Rayatwari system, but eventually, in some form or shape, the Rayatwari system was implemented in the Tirunelveli district, but that was quite further down the line. And Tirunelveli district was quite, you can call it lucky in that sense, because other districts, they had to bear the brunt of the Rayatwari system pretty much straight on. And Colonel Munro, uh, whom I have tackled, in other series, he was responsible for introducing the Rayatwari system. So Tirunelveli district had a favorable systems, and Olungu system was quite favorable. Obviously, we are talking about the best of the worst scenarios. So when I say favorable, it doesn't mean favorable in the real sense of the word. It means favorable compared to the worst options, such as Rayatwari out there. So let's have a look at some graphs and charts. So this is again the net amount of grain left with the farmer as a percentage of average yield, and average yield we have kind of taken as 547 kilos throughout this series. Now you can see the, again, except for a brief period between 1811 and 1814, when like I pointed out, this was when the decennial system was still being fine tuned and implemented. So the amount of grain left with the farmer was actually in the positive, and it went as high as 16% between 1811 1813. But for most part, it was pretty much in the negative, and if you look at the averages, it averages for between -10 to -15% in the negative. Okay. So the farmer was essentially borrowing grain and borrowing money to stay afloat. And the net income of farmer in rupees per acre, again, this reflects the net amount of grain left as well. So same thing. So between 1811 1813, he had 3 rupees per acre net income. Now we are not talking about net profit. This is just net income. So you have to deduct all the cultivation expenses and everything, etc., etc., and then you talk about net profit, which would most probably drive it in the negative again. But for most part, again, a negative income of -1 rupees or -2 rupees throughout till 1821. So after the British occupation, the farmer incomes never really recovered. And Rayatwari land revenue as a percentage of average yield per acre. So again, the land revenue as a percent of average yield being taken as 547 kilos, again fluctuated between 40 to 50% for most part, except for a dip between 1811 and 1813. So these graphs kind of reflect the same reality. So overall, this is a picture which is going to become increasingly common, and the farmer's income and the amount of grain they had was pretty much in the negative for most part. Okay, so that's it for this time, friends. In the next part, we'll look at the Olungu system, which was a little bit more long lasting and lasted till roughly 1859 1860, and we look at the key points of that system as well. So if you have liked this video, please do remember to share, like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next part. Hari Om.